Exodus. I share with you at chapter 13, verse 3. Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place." This is the word of God before us this morning. Please be seated. Well, today we're continuing with chapter 4 of the story. Now, in order to catch you up on what we talked about last week, look again at the little video on the screen, please.
Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite was Joseph. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were working in the fields. Joseph's brothers resented him, and when they saw him coming, they attacked him and threw him in a well. Then they sold their brother as a slave, took off his coat, soaked it in goat's blood, and showed it to their father, tricking him into believing a wild animal had killed Joseph. Soon after, Joseph was sold to a military official in Egypt as a servant. God helped Joseph do great work, and the official was very happy with him. Joseph was very handsome, and the official's wife tried day after day to seduce him. One day, she pressured Joseph so much that he ran out of the house, leaving his coat behind. She told everyone that he tried to force himself on her. The official was furious and threw Joseph in jail. God once again helped Joseph in all he did. And eventually he was put in charge of all the prisoners. Joseph had the special ability to interpret people's dreams. One day, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, asked Joseph to interpret one of his dreams. He dreamed that 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows, and 7 heads of healthy grain were eaten up by 7 heads of dried up grain. God helped Joseph interpret the dream. Egypt would experience 7 years of successful farming, followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh was impressed and put Joseph second in charge of Egypt. During the famine, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food. When they got there, they met with Joseph, but didn't recognize him right away. When Joseph finally told them who he was, they wept because they were sorry for what they had done. Eventually, they went and got their father Jacob and brought him back to Egypt. Joseph took care of his entire family, giving them property in the best part of the land where they lived for the rest of their lives.
Well, let's now continue after the story of Joseph. Now, next to my passion for my family and also for my work here as your pastor, I also have a passion for golf. Not only do I like to play golf, but I also like to watch golf on television. Now, just recently, there was a golf tournament on television to determine who was the best golfer of the entire year. Well, now you would think somebody like Tiger Woods or somebody like Phil Mickelson or Adam Scott would win, right? But no, there was an underdog named Henrik Stenson. He was not very well known, and he won the golf tournament to be the best golfer of the year. You know, I believe that God truly loves underdogs. I believe God really loves underdogs because as God's plan to build up His new nation continued to unfold, God kept choosing underdogs, didn't He? He chose people like Abraham and Joseph to lead His people. Well, after Joseph died, things gradually got worse and worse for the descendants of Joseph, who were called Israelites. Under Joseph's leadership here, the Israelites had settled into Egypt, and they started to grow and grow in number. There became many, many of them. But after Joseph died, there was no one to be a mediator between the Israelites and the Egyptians. the Israelites had now grown so large that the new Pharaoh decided he needed to stop this. And so he came up with a law that would kill every male Hebrew Israelite baby. He decided that to be in control, he would make them all slaves. He would also, in addition to that, put cruel masters over them to make their work very hard. What's going on in God's nation now? From our lower story perspective, it seems here like Pharaoh's in control of everything, and God's nation is falling apart. But God is still in control. About 500 years earlier, God had said this to Abraham: "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants are going to be strangers in a country that is not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated." As we've been seeing here in the story, things don't always work out the way that we think things should, do they? If we were doing things, we would do things differently. Seems like a long time. But in God's timing, it's just like a moment, isn't it? Now it's time for God to help the Israelites. Now is it's time for God to get things going again. And God needs just the right person to do this. So God chooses a man named Moses who's living out in the wilderness taking care of some sheep to do this. God visits Moses in a burning bush, and he comes up with this master plan, this big proposal. God wants Moses to go back to Egypt and to go up to the Pharaoh and tell the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go free. Moses, though, he's overwhelmed by this proposal. Moses says to God, "God, I don't think I can do this. I don't even speak very well. Please, God, pick someone else to do it." Why is Moses so resistant to let God use him? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the early years in Moses' life. When he was a baby, the Pharaoh had this law to kill all those newborn male babies of the Israelites to stop them from growing so fast. But Moses' mother put him in a little basket and put him into the Nile River at the place where Pharaoh's daughter always took her bath. She figured that Pharaoh's daughter would see the little baby and would save him and raise him as her own child. Well, that's the way it happened. Pharaoh's daughter saw the baby, took little Moses into the palace, and Moses was raised there as a prince in the palace. Wow. Well, as Moses got older, one time he saw an Egyptian soldier beating up one of the Israelite slaves. And Moses got real angry about this, and he ended up killing that Egyptian soldier. Well, after he killed him, he was afraid, so he ran away out of Egypt, out into the country. Moses knew if he ever went back, he'd be arrested and he'd be killed. So, Moses here says he can't speak very well. He says he's afraid to go back to Egypt. He says he has no leadership skills. Those sound like pretty good reasons for not wanting to lead God's people out of Egypt, doesn't it? And in our lower story logic, we too would say Moses isn't the right person for this big job in our lives. When we see God's upper story, we can really see Moses is the perfect person. because God knows that Moses was never going to be able to take any credit for leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. No, Moses always is going to have to give God all the credit. So, in God's eyes, Moses here, he's the perfect person. When God comes to us in our lives and says to us that He wants to use us, the best response we can always give is, yes, God, use me. Use me however you want. Well, with all of those objections that Moses made, Moses finally gets his family together and he goes back to Egypt. He went back to Egypt not as a ruler or a leader. He goes back to Egypt as a humble father and a lowly shepherd. Moses was one of the least likely people for God to choose to lead His nation out of Egypt. But God saw something inside of Moses that He could use. God saw a trust, a faith that Moses had that God could use to lead His people out of Egypt. So Moses goes face to face with Pharaoh, and he shares God's message to let the Israelites go free. And Moses, he backs up his word with some pretty good evidence here, doesn't he? Because with God's help, Moses brings 10 ugly plagues on the people of Egypt. And after each one of those plagues, the Pharaoh says to the people, go ahead and go. But as soon as the plague ends, Pharaoh changes his mind. And he won't let the people of Israel go. Finally, though, the last ugly plague does it. God tells Moses that at midnight, an angel's going to come and he's going to kill the oldest male child in every one of the Egyptian families. But God will save the eldest child in the Israelite families if they will take the blood of a lamb and put that blood on the doorpost of their houses. Well, on the fateful night, the firstborn son of every Egyptian family dies. It's a terrible plague. But the Israelite firstborn sons are all saved. This Passover event is still celebrated by many Jewish people today. And we as followers of Jesus get a little picture of how Jesus, as our Passover lamb, is going to later on shed His blood to save you and me from sin and death. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. In a couple weeks, I'll talk a lot more about this. Well, now Pharaoh is so upset at this terrible, terrible plague that he finally lets the Israelites go free. The Israelites, they gather up all their belongings and they're off. They go out from Egypt, out into the country. But when Pharaoh realizes that all of his workforce is gone, he decides he's going to go after them. So he gets his Egyptian army together and he goes following after the people of Israel to bring them back to Egypt. Now the Israelites, they're almost up to this Red Sea, this body of water. And as they're up there, they don't know what they're going to do. Here, the Egyptian army is really coming closer and closer, and they got this huge body of water ahead of them. They're afraid. They think they're all going to die. And then God does something amazing. He opens up the water of the Red Sea. The Israelites walk across. And then as the Egyptian army is trying to go across, the waters come together and kill all of the Egyptian army. Wow. What an amazing God we have. Now maybe you have a Pharaoh in your life right now. That Pharaoh can be a person, could be a circumstance, could be a major conflict that you have in your life. It may seem like that Pharaoh is taking control of your life, and you can't get away from it. But don't give up. Don't be afraid, because remember, in your lower story, It might seem like the Pharaoh's in control, but God has this great upper story planned for your life. And God is going to use those Pharaohs in your life right now to be able to bring you eventually to live with Him in heaven. God really does promise that all things work out for our good. Trust God in this. You may not know exactly how God is going to be able to help you to cross that Red Sea that's in your life right now, but God will take away the obstacles in your life so that you can be with Him forever in heaven. Come back next week to hear more about God's upper story plan for your life. God bless you.